Okay, non-topicality procedurals. Just as in topicality or in any argument, you need to win a reason why the thing that you are defending is better than the thing that the other team is defending. In this way, it is remarkably similar to a plan versus counterplan or plan versus status quo debate. You're advocating for a plan or an interpretation. They're arguing for a counter-interpretation, and you need to win why yours is more beneficial. People lose sight of this very easily, I feel like. At the end of the day, it is competing interpretations weighed on a net beneficial scale. The point of this overview is that because it is weighed like a competing interpretation, you need to have impacts to your standards. Your standards are the things that win you the round, just as your advantages allow you to get impacts that weigh in a debate round. Your standards should have similar impacts, likely just weighed through a different lens. So that lens that they're weighed through would be encapsulated within the voting issue portion of the procedural, that you are arguing that due to whatever reason or warrants you provide, we should prioritize a certain type of education or fairness or something along those lines over other decision-making factors. Why a breach of fairness in this instance is enough to disregard the previous impact calculus or criterion that we were using to do the debate. So the upshot of all of this is you should think of it as advantages and disadvantages, but with an impact framework that is different. You're not doing body counts, obviously, on a interp versus counter-interp debate. You're weighing predictability versus limits and the prep abuse that happens thereof, and why this is more important than that, and why a fairness argument would come before other things in the debate. It's so don't lose sight of that fact when arguing. That's the essential purpose of the debate, is to identify an impact framework and argue why your interpretation, the thing that you are defending, is better than their counter-interpretation, whatever it is they're defending. In terms of the different types, generally, obviously, procedurals get run in two speeches. Those speeches being the LOC, when they're arguing that the something about the construction of the PMC is a bad thing, and also those in the MG. Generally, these relate to counterplan theory or critique theory or what have you. Those are the two speeches, and they have, because of their different place in the structure of the debate, there's a difference in the there's a difference in the things that need to be prioritized. In the LOC, I think you need to spend a little bit more time because they're going to have two speeches to recharacterize everything. The distinction between the LO and the MG is that the MG is giving responses that the op will only have, or is giving arguments that the op will only have one chance to make responses to. By contrast, the LOC is running a procedural that the affirmative will have two chances to respond to. They'll have the MG and they'll have the PMR in order to do that. So in that way, it requires more work is necessary on the standards level of the debate, in my eyes, out of the LOC due to the fact that there's less of a chance to respond. This doesn't mean that necessarily that less time can be spent on MG procedurals. I think a lot of this is because that the effect that the MG has, only having one, I think a lot of judges tend to give leeway to the opposition on MG procedurals due to the time trade-offs involved. That if it's, a 45-second MG shell and a 45-second MO responses and then 5 minutes of PMR responses, it seems like a lot of judges will kind of interpret the negative arguments in the most possible beneficial light, because it seems like the debate's stopping too early. It seems like we should get the neg should get a chance to respond to the PMR, but they never do because our activity is short and doesn't have an extra set of rebuttals. So because of that, I think your arguments in the MO, instead of being offensively oriented, are probably wanting to be a little bit more preemptively oriented, understanding that, okay, you're running an argument that says you can't be conditional, to think of what a lot of the common MO responses to conditionality are, and to try and include arguments within your MG shell that will preempt and counteract a lot of the common responses that you're going to hear, because you know that the natural inclination of the judge is to interpret things in the best possible light. But if you've already said it in the MG and it doesn't get a response, that judge was infinitely more likely to pay attention to it and vote for it because of the fact that it was been out there from the beginning. You've already done this argument comparison, and they didn't respond to it effectively. Those are probably the big overview into how I think you should view these arguments strategically. So now I'm going to talk for a little bit about how you should, about different types of these arguments, and then we'll probably do some examples to kind of have it all play out and see exactly what we need to learn, or how these things play out when applied in an actual argument. Okay, so we'll start out with LOC procedurals. Some of the types. A very common one a few years ago was specification arguments. These have kind of come out of favor in the past few years. They're not as common as they were, but you will still see them occasionally. Basically, these arguments are a way of saying that the plan is too vague in some aspect, that there's some aspect of the plan that needs to be specified, and that the plan has not done that in the PMC. Can range from a spec to you need to specify your agent, or often what branch of the United States federal government, or there's funding specification, there's enforcement specification. All of these have various levels of legitimacy. I think the vast majority of them, I think there has become a general community consensus that the AF shouldn't specify too much beyond the resolution, because it allows them to be extra topical, right? If they specify, oh, and we're going to fund this by taking it all away from this program, they get to have an advantage about defunding a program that has nothing to do with the resolution. So that's the reason why there's been a movement against Spec, is I think the ability of what it would allow the affirmative to do to be extra topical. Conversely, though, there's a expectation that the AF is probably going to allow the negative to link their strategy, whatever it may be. So if the negative is wanting to read, no, Congress shouldn't pass it, it should be done through an executive order counterplan, and the plan text is just the USFG, then it's generally assumed that the affirmative will just kind of go along with that, unless a normal means is considered an obvious dividing line. So I think that's why spec arguments have gone a little bit of the wayside. There's something to be said. I think spec is so disliked in the community now that I think the debates might even be a little too unspecified, because people are so afraid that, well, we might lose if we specify too much on the affirmative, but we're not going to lose too. You didn't specify enough argument, so there's no incentive to specify in a borderline scenario. But
has the spec also been taken away because of these tighter resolutions?
Definitely in a way, but I mean, you can find a way to. There's always going to be something that hasn't been specified, and 3 or 4 years ago, it was kind of absurd, the amount of spec arguments, so I think we're just kind of seeing a natural movement away from that, because everyone kind of realized that was dumb.
I think also too, debate, moves in waves of technicalness, debate will be incredibly technical for a few years at a time, and then it'll become less so and more so, and I think that's part of it, and I think maybe 5 years ago, Harley was very much trying to be policy, and absent cards, spec is silly.
Yeah.
This is my personal opinion, I should have perhaps understood that. It's just, of course you're not gonna specify something, you're talking for 7 minutes, and a plan text is a condensing of bills, right? And bills are thousands of pages long.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are very small instances when it can be justified. Almost in every one of them, it would be if a point of information is asked and then no real answer is provided to that question. So unless you've asked a point of information, there's almost never any justification or any reason why you would want to run a spec argument unless you've done so. It also should be used, it's a means to an end. It's not the round argument you're trying to win the round on. If you're going to run it, it should be, hey, we've got this strategy we want to run that only links if they do it through, if they enforce it through this, through the Bureau of Land Management. If they try to do it through Fish and Wildlife Services, then our disad won't link. So we need to guarantee ourselves a link scenario and kind of try and put them in a double bind that, hey, we don't, as long as you give us our link scenario, we're cool on this, but if you try and link out of this disad, that's proven abuse of over-specifying to get out of DAA links. So that would probably be the only time you would really want to run a spec argument, is in order to try and guarantee yourself access to the strategy that you're trying to run. Other than that, if you take out effects T and extra T, which I would probably assume would be parts of the topicality lectures, there's not a ton that I would really advocate doing out of the LOC, just in the sense of it's, if they're doing something wrong, that it will likely be specific to the very thing that their plan text is doing. There are probably ways in which you can structure a plan text that it would be pretty unfair, but there's not a universal, I would say, well, you can run this type of argument. It would be, you can't do that thing you're doing. And so probably thinking about it in a more broad-based, broad scope of how you access the standards, not this is the type of argument you run, I guess, because you'll run other ones, but they won't be as fit neatly into the categories as the spec arguments or the counterplan theory arguments or anything like that. So apply for other LOC procedurals, apply the skills and ability to weigh standards against each other that you use in all of these other things to whatever the specific situation of the affirmative is. All right, in terms of MG procedurals, or do you guys want to do an example of a spec argument and how it would play out? Or do you think we don't need to? Okay, cool. I agree, right choice. I might have talked myself out of it, but if we do, we'll do it later. We'll see. I want to build that tension where you don't know. Now you're just wondering, is he going to do that spec example? Oh my God. It is. It's going to be wild. But, all right, MG procedurals. Again, the vast majority of these are against counterplans or critiques. Certainly, any specification argument that can be read against a plan can also be read equally against a counterplan. But all of the things that apply to why specification arguments might not be the best on the negative are also applicable to that as well. So it's an option that we might go over in example form later, but it's not anything to spend too much time on now. questions of status of counterplans or alternatives in general. Status is, in case we need the update, is whether or not you're going to, is how you conceptualize your alternative or your counterplan. Is it your advocacy throughout the round? Is it, this is what we're defending, we win if we prove this advocacy is better than you, or you win if you prove that your advocacy is better than this? That's unconditional. It's going to be your advocacy throughout the round. There's conditional, which generally can be the, we can advocate this counterplan. We can also kick it and advocate the status quo. With inconditionality, there is a couple different options. There are people who say that we can go for, that the way that counterplans function is that even if we go for our conditional counterplan in the block, if we're losing on that, like if they read a disad to the counterplan that we're losing on, we can still win if the counterplan essentially goes away and you would revert to the status quo. There are other people who would say, I would say probably the more common thought on conditionality is that the negative usually should pick in the MO. That's what most people would say when they mean conditionality, is that the negative can run any number of one or multiple counterplans if they so choose, and they can advocate the status quo, but in the MO, they have to essentially kick out of all the other ones and say this is what our strategy is going to be. I would say that's the more commonly accepted definition within the Parley community. I think that's probably, it's moving a little more towards the one that they can go for the counterplan in the block and then revert to the status quo if they lose the counterplan. But I don't think the community's made that full transition yet. I think it's just kind of starting to move in that direction. Questions of status. Oh, there's also dispositional. Dispositional counterplans are ones that are generally the rule is that, okay, the affirmative runs a plan, the negative runs a dispositional counterplan. What this means is that if the MG just says, here's why the here's why the counterplan's bad, they read a disad to it, it doesn't solve, this counterplan sucks, the negative's stuck with it. But if the negative reads a permutation and says, okay, we can do both, then the negative can kick the counterplan in the block. So the distinction is, in dispositional, they're stuck with it. If you just read counterplan bad, they're able to kick it if you read permutation arguments. Generally, the logic behind this is, think of it like the affirmative saying, hey, we've got one plan, we're going to run this, or excuse me, think of it as the negative saying, hey, we're fine with having one plan and we'll stick to one advocacy as long as you do. But if you start to use this permutation, it's messing with, you're not really advocating the perm, but it's messing with what the world of, and so it's not just plan versus counterplan, it's counterplan versus permutation. If you are taking that step, then we agree, then we think we should have two options as well. If you have plan and perm where you can try and win, we have status quo or counterplan that we can win. But if you don't utilize that tool, that perm tool, and you just say counterplan's bad, then we will agree to that as well, and we won't do that. So that's a way that it can get out of the, that's a way that you can kind of hedge your bets between between conditionality and unconditionality. You can try and get some of the benefits of being conditional, but not just say, hey, we can do whatever you want. It gives some control back to the affirmative because they can determine whether or not they're stuck with it by their argumentative choices. If they just choose to read disads to it, then they can't kick it, so it takes away a strategic option. In general, for any question of status, the procedural debate comes down to the split of the MG and how that negatively impacts the affirmative chances of winning. So the idea being that the the LOC gets 8 minutes to read offense against the plan, but the MG only gets 4 minutes to read responses that are tailored to the status quo and responses to the disad that are tailored to the counter plan. They have to answer two different worlds and make their arguments make sense within them. The MO then just gets to pick, and by getting to pick, they get to exploit that time trade-off unfairly. So the MG has had to split their time arguing as if the counterplan does, and if the counterplan does not exist, the MO can essentially avoid those arguments, and in so doing can provide more and deeper analysis on the one that they end up deciding to go for. And if that's the case, then theoretically they should be able to win more rounds. That is, you'll see a lot of different standards on conditionality, but they all essentially boil down to that, of it's bad because it squeezes the MG. The response to this, again, you will see bunches of different standards, but they all essentially come down to arguments of why the negative should have strategic flexibility, and why strategic flexibility is a good thing. We can talk a little bit about that more when we do an example of the conditionality debate. We should have time. But I do want to highlight real quick when I talk about earlier at the top of this, how you just have to realize it's a lot like advantage versus disadvantage debate. You just have to, prove a net benefit to your interpretation or your counter interpretation. I think it's a good example of that in the Condi versus uncondi debate. If you're advocating for unconditionality, your advantage that you're going to be winning is that the MG is not split in in the world of your interpretation, whereas it is in the world of the other interpretation. If you're on the other side of that debate, you're going to get greater strategic flexibility for the negative, but you are going to have the disad of MG split time. So that's what the debate comes down to, and we should be trying to think of impacts as they relate to fairness. All of the possible ways in which we can isolate how split MG time negatively impacts the affirmative, how strategic flexibility is essential for the negative to counteract PM having, or the affirmative speaking first and last and having 20 minutes of guaranteed prep. It's like all of those questions boil down to that point, and it's coming up with impacted reasons why your argument is more important than their argument. Other types of counterplan theory. Again, many of these are quite specific to the counterplan being run. There's a split in the community about whether textual competition should be the standard used to judge counterplan competitiveness. Does everyone know what textual competition is? I think it would probably be helpful to have a refresher on some level. Textual competition has had many different definitions, and I think there's a lot of confusion on it. The way that it's always been said to make sense to me, which I get, which it makes sense in my head, is that if the entirety of the affirmative can exist within the world of the counterplan, it is not textually competitive. Whereas, excuse me, yes, I was right in the first time. If the entirety of the plan can be in existence, and they can do both at the same, then it's not textually competitive. If there's any of the plan that can't be in existence in the world of the counterplan, that is an issue of what counterplan that is textually competitive, because it, through its inaction, would prevent part of the plan from being put into place. There are also I don't want to spend too much time getting into it because I think there's an esoteric minutia of the debate that is probably not all that necessary for an hour-long lecture where we have other stuff to cover. So I'm going to stick with that as that is a working definition of textual competition. That's what it ends up meaning. That's not the argumentative back and forth thought process that led to the settling on of textual competition, but that's what the end result is. So what does that mean, this textual competition? Generally, it excludes things that are a little bit like, often called kind of cheater counter plans, your delays. Delay where it's, we're going to do the plan in 3 months after the elections. The entirety of what happens in the affirmative plan exists within the world of that counter plan. As that's the case, that's something that is not textually competitive because all of the plan can exist. It gets rid of consult, where, hey, all of these, we should consult with China about whether we should do plan and do whatever they say. So if China says yes, then the entirety of the affirmative can exist within the world of the counterplan. So because China could say yes, that is an example of where it's not textually competitive. Things that are textually competitive are things like picks, do all of plan except for this one thing that we're excluding, because there's a part of the plan that exists that cannot exist in the world of the counterplan. There are downsides to textual competition. I think generally, I've given you the working definition. There's a lot of thought that there should be more specific textual requirements and the way in which you have to write a counterplan to ensure that that's not true. The world doesn't exist, that whole thing. There's ways in which we can talk about that, but I think the downside to textual competition overall is that it makes sense in a world with aft disclosure where, like in policy, where people are telling us this is what our plan text is, so people have time to write counterplan texts that are tailored specifically to what the affirmative is going to be. There's also in-round prep where people can just spend time writing out their counterplan texts. So all of these structural differences between policy and parley make it a more logical standard and burden to uphold counterplans to, because there's all this time allowing it, whereas in parley it's a time crunched activity. There's no in-round prep. AFs change every time, the resolution changes every time, so it's a little bit less precise in its wording than policy is going to be, just by virtue of the structural differences in the activity. The benefit to it is that it provides a baseline. It tells you, it creates a standard for what is and isn't okay. The problem I've always had is, let's say you've got a normal procedural here that, what's a counterplan procedural you hear a lot? What?
Vagueness, bullshit.
There, picks bad. We'll just do that. Okay. No. Picks not allowed is that. And then violation, their pick, standards. Problem that you often run into on the standards debate is, well, what are you comparing it to? What are picks not allowed? So it means picks are some deviation from some norm that you're saying is unacceptable. But it's not a definition of what is. It kind of leaves what's a normal fair counterplan unspoken. That's not defined what a fair counterplan is. Because let's say you do this, like, consult's unfair, and your counterinterpretation doesn't exclude consult. It means that there's not a fully precise interpretation for most counterplan procedurals. The reason for that is a really precise interpretation would say these are the types of acceptable counterplans. Instead, and that's what textual competition does. Textual competition sets a standard for what is acceptable, what is not. Ones that like this that just say, hey, the type of counterplan you run, that's bad, that is less acceptable in a lot of ways because it doesn't establish that baseline for what's the acceptable level of offense against that interpretation. Does that make sense? Were there any questions on it? Okay. I think that textual competition is something that there was a lot of resistance to it for a while, I think because people were more focused on that textual aspect of it. As I think there's been a bit of a transition to more think of it in the working definition way of just, all of the world of the counterplan, all of the world of the plan can exist within the counterplan, means it's not textually competitive. That is a more easy to digest standard, and because that's becoming more the accepted norm, I think textual competition in this form is going to become more of a prominent thing than it has been in the past, because it does set a standard, what's okay, what's not. Pretty much every other interpretation in a counterplan theory debate is not as precise as textual competition can be. You will also run into permutation theory. Does everyone know what severance and intrinsicness perms are? Or should we just we'll do a very quick overview. So a severance perm is something that takes away part of it's an argument that the MG would run that would say, hey, we can perm by not doing this part of our affirmative, and that perm would be beneficial. So it severs out something that's in the PMC, is not in the permutation.
Is that seen as an advocacy shift though, or?
It becomes a question of whether a permutation is an advocacy. Most would argue that it's not, that the permutation is functionally a no-link argument. It's saying, hey, if we could do both of these at the same time, then there's no reason to prefer the counterplan. So it's not we're advocating for this perm, but the fact that the perm exists and is beneficial is a reason why you shouldn't prefer the counterplan. Does that make sense? But yes, and that is the disadd to the argument, is that it's shifty, is that you've stated you're going to do something, the permutation would be, if the permutation were there, it would take away part of what the affirmative was originally, which would be a bad thing. That's why severance perms are bad, is because they take away the stability of the AF. Intrinsicness are kind of the opposite in that they add something that is not in either the plan or the counterplan. So it adds additional planks or actions or something that's like, oh, we could do this, and if we did it in this way, it would solve all the problems of those two branches working together or something. It's adding something to make the combination of the two more palatable or acceptable. They're considered, I would say, slightly more acceptable in certain situations. It's very rare to find people who would say severance perms really are acceptable. You can win on them in a cheap shot theory debate if you trick somebody, but no one actually thinks there's ever a time when severing out of your AF is something that you should really be allowed to do. There are times, it's rare, but there are times when you will hear arguments that have some merit, like process counterplans, which rely on stupid normal means bullshit for competition, justify intrinsicness permutations to, if they're assuming things about our plan and then basing this response off them. So even though it's not within the plan text, an intrinsic permutation is justified in order to disincentivize this type of stupid counterplan. You will hear that argument, and it's it's reasonable, and certainly more accepted than the severance perm, but it's rare. For a while, people were running severance perm. Hey, you severance perm, you lose. I don't think anyone really does that too much anymore, again, unless it's dropped. I think the far more prominent is just this is not an effective permutation. Like, as I was talking earlier, the permutation functions as a no-link, that the fact that these can coexist in this way and be beneficial is a reason why you shouldn't vote for the counterplan. That's what a perm is. If a perm is severance or intrinsic, it's not a valid way of showing that. It's not a valid no-link because it has to either take part of the AF away or it has to add new stuff. And so if that's the case, then it doesn't function as a valid no-link of the counterplan. Let's do some examples. Oh, before we do, just one last strategic point I wanted to talk about in this is that many of these debates are kind of exactly the same. I talked with this a little bit about the conditionality versus unconditionality. It's stability versus flexibility. That is the argument that it's going to come down to. Most of these are going to have kind of one or two main arguments that most of these issues have been debated out hundreds of times, and there are scholarly journals written about and there are certainly camps on each side of the debate, but there are a certain number of people say this is what the debate's about over this topic, is this thing or this other versus this other thing. And so since you know that and are able to do it, much of the work in these procedurals is able to be done beforehand. You don't need to have seen what the specifics of their counterplan or their responses are in order to make preemptory responses. You know in a lot of ways what their responses are going to be, or at least the touchstones that they're going to touch on and be reliant on to get offensive arguments against your interpretation. If you can know that, you can do your best to try and preempt those arguments and to frame your arguments in such a way that is beneficial. So yeah, let's do conditionality. Generally, the inter is something along the lines of the beg, entitled to advocate status quo or one competitive policy option. Basically saying you get to just read disads or you get to read counterplan, but you got to pick. The violation then would be they read a conditional counterplan which allows them to do both of those things. So this is or, they are and. The standards then, I'm going over here, it's backwards, but it'll work. All right, so the standards, you can call it anything. Some will call it MG abuse, some will call it time skew, some will call it whatever. It all comes down to that same thing basically, it splits the MG. And so as a whole, another overview point about winning procedurals is that I think you win procedurals by going for them. Right? And I mean that in committing time to it at the beginning, of going beyond the normal level of taglines that are often seen in your typical debates. It makes it difficult to, there are very few judges that are going to vote on a 30-second Condi show unless very significant parts of it are dropped. And it's because you're just not able to get the depth that is necessary in order to really flesh out for, like, if you're really going for it in the PMR. And it's hard to create a logical decision calculus for why fairness should come first, why all of these things in 30 seconds of argumentation. And so the time that should be spent beefing these procedurals up then is on the standards debate. And so I think it's contextualizing and making concrete a lot of the words people say. People say, splits the MG, has to debate in two different worlds, and they are kind of vague references to the type of thing that is happening, but I think being specific and really playing it out exactly which ones, exactly the type of unfairness that's occurring. So an MG might say, the LO is guaranteed 8 minutes of offense against one advocacy. The MG must split time between two different worlds. Status quo CP, right? So, why is that bad? This is where you get into the specifics of it, of at that point, the LOR then has, or excuse me, after the MG is split, the block has 12 minutes to compare to the 4 minutes that the MG, if the MG evenly split their time, let's hypothetically assume, 4 minutes of MG answers versus 12 minutes of block answers from the MO and the LOR. So the ability of the LO to read two conditional advocacies, or to read a conditional advocacy and potentially defend the status quo, means that the MG, not only do they already have to deal with the LOR that's coming later, but they have to split their time, and this time trade-off that's created will allow the negative team to provide better warrants and just more warrants on the salient issues of the round. It also just gives the, I'll go into that actually, it's that next argument a little bit later. Then the, how do I phrase this? This problem's exacerbated by the need to occasionally make arguments that could be seen as contradictory. So not only does the MG have to split their time, but the arguments that might be applicable in comparing the plan to the status quo are not the same arguments that are going to be applicable comparing the plan to the counterplan. The counterplan changes the frame of reference, and so the relevant responses are going to be different. As that becomes played out in the course of a round, that can very easily result in the MO having to make an argument against the status quo that could be seen as potentially helping the counterpoint. So that creates just another fine strategic line that the MG has to walk that is never a problem for the negative because they only have one advocacy to defend against. So this is one standard, but it's really in depth. It would probably take you about 20 seconds to read the entirety of that standard going at a pretty good clip in a round. And you only have 8 minutes for an MG, which is already the most time-crunch speech in the debate. So, yes, it takes time, but I think it's a pretty, if you're going to be, it's better to take to take a minute for an argument that you have a chance of winning and going for in the block, or excuse me, in the PMR, like a really good, beefed up counterplan theory shell, than it is to spend 30 seconds going for a shell that you're almost certainly not going to win because it's too light on warrants, and then you've also taken away 30 seconds that you could be using to make against other arguments. So if you're going to have if you're going to be running a counterplan theory shell, I think you should be doing it with the idea of potentially going for it and winning it in the PMR. There's never a time where, unless there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be a part of your PMR strategy, I don't think it's worth it or strategic to run counterplan theory because you're more time crunched than the MO, so you're not going to time suck them, right? Like, they can kick disads, they can already do this, you're not going to, the MG is the most time crunch speech in the debate, and as a result of that, you shouldn't be you should be avoiding extra time responsibilities at all costs. Another standard that you could use on Condi is, you could say something along the lines of Condi conditionality rewards bad debate and punishes good debate. I think you can make an educational argument that if you do everything perfectly as an MG, if they're running an unconditional advocacy and they read like 3 disads, and if it's, say, a really bad disad and you've got a straight turn on it, you can just non-unique and link turn it, you're not going to read any defense whatsoever, you're going for the turn on this position. In a world of unconditionality, that means they're stuck with it. They have to answer it because there's no defensive arguments that they can pull that would allow them to kick out of it. There's no impact that they can say, oh, well, there's no difference between these two, so you can just ignore this disad. There's no link. There's nothing like that. And that's an example of good MG strategic decision making. Conditionality allows the opposition to say, oh, we fucked up on that, and you ran an incredibly good argument against us. Good thing we don't have to talk about it anymore. And so we're just going to ignore the really good argument. Debate as a whole should be designed to accentuate and reward good arguments and deprioritize and try to decrease the incidence of bad arguments. That should be a logical organization, how we should structure things. To the extent that conditionality creates the opposite incentives, it is a structure that should not be put into place. Both of these, I think a lot of times the level of analysis that you'll see on this is the MG splits of prep time, has to answer in 2 worlds, never going to be able to compete. That's the response, and it's not detailed enough to get judges to really care that much. Judges feel very comfortable if there's something that I guess is technically dropped, but it's a sentence, which is just a claim and doesn't have any warrants. They feel very comfortable saying, well, yeah, it was dropped, but I didn't really care about it. It didn't mean anything to me. They're not going to do that if you have a bunch of warrants, and you spell out the process step by step. You can win arguments as long as you don't make them say, you don't give judges the opportunity to say, just didn't do it. You know, if you spell it out specifically enough, it takes away their ability to just dismiss the position, which a lot of judges will want to do. Not many judges like procedurals a ton. Even when I debated, I ran a ton of procedurals, and as a judge, it's not as much up my alley. They were a lot more fun to participate in for me than they are to observe. So it should be used as a strategic option, but with the idea in mind that a lot of judges aren't enormous fans of counterpoint theory. We only got time really for one example. I think we're getting close to being done. Does anyone have any questions?
As I know it varies from judge to judge, but do you have a preference in the MG, whether it is like a full structured picks are bad or delay counterplans are bad, or do you prefer people just making the types of arguments like delay is bad because it makes an unpredictable future?
I think it dovetails with the question of text comp, because text comp is the problem with your counterplan bad in this instance. Like, if you assume that delay counterplans are bad and you just read that warrant against a delay counterplan, it doesn't define what's acceptable. It doesn't define the comparison from just as in order to understand impacts, you have to understand the status quo. You have to understand the deviation from the status quo. So what's unique about what's unique about the plan that causes this impact? Similarly, you need to have a vision of what's acceptable, what's the norm from which you can argue that the counterplan is deviating and is bad. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so the textual competition is the mechanism or the standard that's put in place to determine that. And it has the advantage of not being arbitrary. I think that as long as if we're not doing textual competition, which is I think what it's moving towards, if you're not doing that, you should at least have an interpretation and the violation and spell that out. Yeah. Any other questions? The general overview, find out what argument you're winning, make a bunch of arguments about why that's the most important argument. It sounds remarkably simple, but on all of these, there's going to be an argument on any side of the common ones you'll see that you're definitely going to be beating the counter interpretation on. Without question, on a conditionality versus unconditionality debate, you're going to have an argument that you're winning. If you are able to make that impact big and win the comparative analysis, you've guaranteed got the link. It's only impact weighing at that point. And so that's all stuff you can do beforehand. So figure out what that is, what you're given, and then win that.